Detective Morgan Walsh sat frozen, her eyes on the DNA report, her mind too stunned to process what she was reading, her coffee growing cold on the counter. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, buzzing softly, filled the lab with an unending drone as stillness enveloped her. 30 years of detective work, thousands of tips, countless losses, and now one sheet of paper could blow everything apart. "Run it again," she whispered, her voice the blood morse the third generation Richardson. Her voice languid, she whispered, her voice lustum, her voice marimbus listless. And gordos la aridus, word sport, her voice. The technician shook his head. "We've run it 3 times already. The match is 99.88% conclusive." Walsh slumped into her chair, the weight of what she now knew bearing down on her as never before. The face that flashed through her mind wasn't a stranger, a drifter, or some faceless predator who haunted the edges of town. It was a familiar one, someone who had sat in on community meetings, provided solace to bereaved families, to bereaved families, to bereaved families, to bereaved families. "Sheriff Thompson must know about this now," she replied, her hand shaking a little as she picked up her phone. In a few short hours, the peaceful roads of Nihill County would be turned on their heads. The man who had lived among them for decades, a familiar figure in the community, would be exposed as the monster who had taken Harper Davis and Stella Lewis from their families. Harper's vanishing in 1993 left a wound that never healed, never he swore of, that never he. The 16-year-old was last seen at the Riverside gas station on a fog-shrouded October evening, leaving behind only her purse and one shoe in the parking lot. For 6 years, her case remained a haunting, unresolved enigma. Then, in 1999, 20-year-old Stella Lewis went missing under eerily similar conditions a mere 15 miles away. Same time of year, same sort of setting, same absence of witnesses. The trend was unmistakable, and what initially was fear gradually escalated to terror as the community became aware that a sinister force had infested their tranquil part of Alberta. For 3 decades, the crimes remained unsolved. Photographs of the missing girls faded on pinboards. Families were stuck in a cycle of hope and bereavement. What makes this tale so remarkable isn't only how long it was before it was solved, but who did it and how they got away with their sinister secret while standing in public view. This is the tale of how state-of-the-art DNA technology at last brought 2 families who never lost hope to a semblance of justice. It's the tale of a close-knit community having to face deception from one of its very own most trusted. Most eerily, it's the tale of how a decades-long predator went undetected, deceiving all, including investigators themselves. If you like stories of justice finally being served, subscribe for more cold cases like this one. And I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Leave it in the comments below. October 17th, 1993 began like any normal Sunday for the Davis household. Harper, a vivacious and ambitious 16-year-old with aspirations of becoming a veterinarian, had spent the morning assisting her father in mending fencing on their modest farm outside of Nihill County. Autumn air had grown crisp, rolling hills and countryside rolling out as far as the eye could see, mountains sitting in the distance behind low-hanging clouds. She was in high spirits that day. Harper's father, Thomas Davis, remembered in his fifth upper in his fingsagets the interest, remembered in his fist things like your mother elids loud, remembered in his fishes lost land, remembered in his things on lumber. She had just aced a biology test on Friday and was expecting to meet friends at the library later that afternoon. At 4:38 p.m., cameras at the Riverside gas station recorded Harper entering. She was dressed in blue jeans, a red and black flannel shirt, and a navy blue windbreaker, attire that would be featured on missing person posters in 3 counties. The video revealed her purchasing a Diet Coke and package of licorice. She had a brief conversation with the cashier, Marlene Winters, who afterward reported to investigators that Harper was perfectly normal. She was herself, Winters said. She said she had to get to the library before it closed at 6. I recall glancing at the clock as she was leaving. It was 4:42 p.m. when Harper was seen leaving the store by the security camera, walking towards her car, a Sweet 16 present from her grandparents, a 1988 blue Honda Civic. That is the last known sighting of Harper Davis. When she didn't return home by 9 p.m., her parents began to call Harper's friends. They hadn't seen her at the library. By 10:30 p.m., Thomas Davis drove to the Riverside gas station, but Harper's Honda remained parked at the end of the lot. Her purse occupied the passenger seat, containing her wallet, library card, and house key. By early morning, over 200 volunteers were at the gas station, organized into search parties that searched the nearby woods, fields, and drainage ditches. Sheriff Dale Thompson, a young deputy at the time, coordinated with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to establish roadblocks at all major highways out of the county. We handled it as an abduction from minute one, Thompson would later describe. The abandoned vehicle, the single sneaker, it all indicated a struggle. Cadaver dogs smelled nothing. Helicopters with thermal imaging sensors picked up no sign of the missing teenager. Detectives questioned all registered sex offenders in a 100-mile radius, but nothing was developed. As weeks had turned into days, Nihill County itself had apparently transformed. Doors that were seldom locked were now bolted. Parents took children to school instead of walking or biking. Riverside's gas station was used as an ad hoc command center. Harper's school photo taped on the front window, a chilling reminder of the life lost. Speculations regarding her disappearance went rampant. Some felt a truck driver on a long distance who happened to pass by on the adjacent highway had abducted her. As a rumor mongered regarding a possible link to a set of Saskatchewan unsolved vanishings 2 years prior. A small but loud contingent opined Harper had likely fled, referencing an altercation she'd had with her mother prior to the disappearance. That's absolute nonsense. Catherine Davis said to the press 6 weeks after her daughter disappeared. Harper would never abandon her car. She would never abandon her dog. And she'd sure as heck not abandon without giving her little brother a goodbye hug. Someone took my daughter. The inquiry ran into its first serious speed bump when the security tape was less useful than anticipated. The camera was positioned only at the entrance to the store and caught only a section of the parking lot. Harper's vehicle had been parked out of the line of the camera, giving police no visual evidence of anything that occurred after October. And 3 months into the hunt, there was a possible break. A hunting knife was discovered in a culvert half a mile from the gas station. The initial tests indicated blood on the blade, creating a mix of fear and hope throughout the community. That hope was eliminated when lab tests indicated that the blood belonged to an animal, not a person. But the Davis family, never did they lose hope that we would get to the bottom of things. As the anniversary of Harper's vanishing in a year drew near, the investigation had yielded over 3,000 pages of reports, hundreds of interviews, and 0 concrete leads. The FBI had been brought in with their expertise in cases involving profiling and abductions, but even their resources were not enough to solve it. In a particularly heartbreaking turn, a psychic claiming to have visions of Harper led investigators to an abandoned farm well 10 miles north of the gas station. For 3 days, specialized teams worked to drain thousands of gallons of water and sift through decades of debris, yet still no trace of Harper was found. Nothing related to the case was ever discovered, but the psychological burden on the Davis family ran deep. That, Thomas Davis would come to remember, was the worst part. Every false lead, every fleeting ray of hope was like losing Harper all over again. By 1996, Harper's case had officially gone cold. The tip line that used to ring with calls now occasionally rang. Search parties that had consisted of hundreds became mere Davis family members and a few of their closest friends. The candlelight vigil on the anniversary of her disappearance became Nihill County's most somber tradition, a quiet reminder of innocence lost and justice delayed. What no one could have anticipated was that the horror was hardly finished. Only 3 years later, another young woman would disappear in circumstances so similar that even the most cynical detectives couldn't dismiss the trend. And in that instant, the countdown would begin on one of Alberta's most confounding enigmas. November 2nd, 1999, 6 years and 16 days to the exact day that Harper Davis vanished from the Riverside service station, witnessed the start of another nightmare. The case had dropped from newspaper headlines but was still raw in Nihill County. The parents of Harper were still residing in the same farmhouse. Her bedroom remained. The annual candlelight vigil continued to attract a devoted crowd, and Sheriff Dale Thompson continued to keep Harper's file in the right-hand drawer of his desk and read over it each month in the hopes of catching something that everyone else had not. It was against this that 20-year-old Stella Lewis disappeared. Like Harper, Stella wasn't from around here. She'd spent her whole life in Calgary and only recently, 4 months before her disappearance, moved to Nihill County to go to the Agricultural Technical Institute where she was studying soil science. Teachers said she was meticulous and a genius. Friends said she was reserved, with a dry sense of humor that came out after you got to know her. Standing at 5'7" with auburn hair typically pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail, Stella had adjusted to country living with ease despite her urban birth. She adored open spaces. Her roommate, Jenna Martin, informed investigators later that Stella spent weekends hiking and gathering soil samples for fun. Who does that for fun? Stella did. In the evening of November 2nd, Stella had been late in the laboratory on campus conducting soil composition analysis for her midterm project. The security cameras caught her exiting the science building at 9:38 p.m. Call records validated that she called her mom while on her way to her car, making plans for Thanksgiving dinner. The call dropped at 9:47 p.m., with Stella stating that she needed to fill up with Gab. That was the last heard of her. The Pine Creek Gas Mini-Mart, 15 miles from the location where Harper disappeared, was a relatively new facility constructed in 1997. 8 pumps were lit by bright fluorescent lights. At 10:12 p.m., Stella's credit card bought her $12.47 worth of gas. The sale went through, but she never made it back to her apartment. Her roommate called her missing the next morning when she realized Stella's bed had not been occupied. By noon, police had discovered her car, a green 1995 Toyota Corolla, included parked at pump number 5 at the Pine Creek Gas Mini-Mart. The gas cap was back in place. Her keys were gone from the ignition, and beside the rear tire lay a lone brown leather boot on its side. For older Nihill County residents, it was an insingular. I was physically sick when I received the call, Sheriff Thompson would later confess. The lone shoe, the gas station. Again, I knew it right away. The similarities were striking. Both young women had vanished from gas stations. Both vanishing acts took place during fall. Both abandoned a lone item of footwear. Both cars were intact with no robbery indicator, and both women were never heard from again. The response this time was immediate and colossal. Within a few hours, the Alberta Bureau of Investigation was in command, opening command posts at both the Pine Creek Gas Mini-Mart and the original Riverside gas station. The Canadian military sent helicopters with state-of-the-art thermal imaging technology. Dozens of volunteers appeared, and with them came many of the same worn orange vests they had worn 6 years before during the search for Harper. Stella's parents, Richard and Marion Lewis, drove in from Calgary that night, their faces ghostly and haggard as they were led past the media camp already forming along the highway. Unlike the Davis family, which had been relatively private, the Lewises spoke to the cameras right away. Please, I'm begging you, help us find our daughter." The residents reacted with support mixed with fear. School enrollment fell by almost 40% during the week after Stella went missing. Local gun stores sold out as residents armed themselves, and the county commissioner instituted a sunset curfew for all persons under 18 years old. In the background, investigators rushed to tie the two cases together. Rookie Detective Morgan Walsh had worked on the Harper Davis case. He now headed a task force dedicated to finding connections. "We pulled every document, every statement, every shred of evidence," Walsh said. "We re-interviewed everyone who was associated with Harper's case and asked if they ever mentioned Stella or the Pine Creek region. We created a database of everybody who lived in the county during both times. We were searching for the overlap, the key that would open both secrets." One of the earliest breakthroughs was achieved when observers saw that both gas stations were supplied by the same regional distribution center. This set off intensive questioning of delivery drivers, mechanics, and corporate staff who may have been aware of both locations. Although this avenue of investigation didn't provide a direct tip, it set a new investigative strategy: look for links, however weak, between the two crime sites. With the second week of searching for Stella, media coverage ramped up. National television teams covered Nihill County, and undesirable attention and wild speculation followed. Psychics and self-styled crime experts flocked to the small town. Some residents said they were approached with offers of money for interviews or inside information. All along, the Davis family stood by in silent horror, observing yet another family embark on the same heartbreaking journey they knew all too well. Catherine Davis made contact with Marion Lewis, and the two mothers established a connection that would see them through the worst of times to come. "Catherine told me to keep hope alive, but train for the marathon," Marion went on to write in her memoir. She said, "Discovering the truth is not a sprint. It's a very painful journey that will strain every ounce of your being." By December of 1999, investigators had created the first full profile of the individual who would be responsible for both of the disappearances. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit suggested they were looking for a white male between 25 and 45, likely employed in a role requiring travel throughout the county. He would be organized, methodical, and familiar with rural areas. Most chillingly, he would appear entirely normal to those who knew him, possibly even charming and well regarded in the community. "Nobody lives in the shadows," FBI Special Agent Lauren Reeves said in an off-record briefing with area police. "This is somebody who fits in, somebody that people like, somebody who understands the routines of this place and can go about their business without being noticed." The profile led detectives to interview people who worked for the community in any way: delivery men, utility men, traveling salesmen, even police officers. More than 200 men were questioned, their alibis carefully screened and rescreened. The tensions mounted as neighbors started watching each other with suspicion. Both groups of families gathered for a combined candlelight service in the local high school gym. More than 1,000 people turned out, standing shoulder to shoulder in reverent silence. With winter falling over Alberta, the search on the ground grew more daunting. Frozen earth made digging all but impossible, and snow blanketed possible evidence. Yet the investigation went on in other ways, with analysts comparing every aspect of the two young women's lives with minute care. In February 2000, there was a possible lead that gave hope briefly. A hiker discovered a woman's watch in a ravine 30 miles north of Pine Creek. The watch seemed to be the same one Stella was seen wearing in recent photos, but time had weathered it too much for it to be identified. For 3 long weeks, the Lewis family waited while forensic officials attempted to recover DNA from the wristband. In the end, it was determined the watch belonged to someone else entirely, a hiker who had reported it missing 2 years earlier. By the first anniversary of Stella's disappearance, the dual investigation was one of the biggest in Alberta history. More than 15,000 man-hours had been spent on the cases. All registered sex offenders in a 200-mile radius had been interviewed a dozen times or more. Dive units searched 7 lakes and ponds. Ground-penetrating radar scanned dozens of areas where suspiciously turned-over earth had been reported, and still there was no sign of either of these young women. What became most obvious was that these were not indiscriminate attacks. The parallels were too exact, too deliberate. This was the handiwork of someone who had crafted a system, a killer who had escaped once and had waited patiently to do it again. We're dealing with a predator who is exceptionally careful, Sheriff Thompson told his deputies during a strategy session in late 2000. He doesn't kill on impulse. He plans. He watches. He waits. And the hardest part to accept is that he might be watching us right now, maybe even helping with the investment, maybe even helping with the envy, methodological too. Being with all met with rigging to I for wall is and as a leading of this with about all that terrifying prospect that the murderer could be among them, perhaps even helping to search for his victims, hung over the community like a dark cloud. Trust was lost as the unsolved murders stretched from months to years. Everybody was a suspect. Every alibi was doubted. Every coincidence was suspect. What nobody could have foreseen was that the truth would be buried for decades, and when it did see the light of day, it would topple Nihill County's foundations in ways nobody could have possibly imagined. Where are you viewing from currently? Leave it in the comments below. I'd love to know. As 2001 gave way to 2002, the search for Harper Davis and Stella Lewis became a frustrating new chapter. The deluge of tips had turned into a trick of the stalwart task force was slowly disbanded and reassigned to other cases. The omnipresent media that had swarmed Nihill County in the earlier days vanished, leaving 2 bereaved families and a community forever scarred. Watching a fire die is like that, Thomas Davis said in a rare interview 5 years after his daughter vanished. At first, there's all this enormous response, flames all around, everyone running to assist. Then it reduces to M to M, to M to M, then it reduces to M to M. But with us, the embers never cool. That's our child out there somewhere. By 2003, the joint case files for both cases took up 17 evidence boxes in the Nihill County Sheriff's Department evidence room. All the leads had been pursued. All the witnesses had been interviewed and re-interviewed. All the physical evidence had been examined until technology at the time knew no bounds. Sheriff Dale Thompson, whose career had been marked by these cold cases, wouldn't let them be forgotten. I keep their photos on my desk, Thompson said in an interview with a reporter on the 10th anniversary of Harper's disappearance. First thing I see every morning, last thing I see when I go home. Some cases get under your skin. These 2 got under mine. Harper's soccer medals quietly occupied the shelves, dust gathering on them. Her calendar was kept turned forever to October 1993, but even in their own grieving, her family managed to cherish her memory. They created a scholarship at the local high school, given every year to a student studying veterinary science, the career Harper had desired. Richard and Marion Lewis directed their grief in a different way. They became vocal advocates for missing persons throughout Canada, establishing the Stella Lewis Foundation in 2004. The group provided resources to families who were trying to navigate the bureaucratic morass that follows a disappearance and supported specialized training for rural police forces. Take Stella home, we couldn't, Marion said at a fundraising campaign, but we could ensure that other families received the support we lacked in the Ingerlisi, the support we lacked in the Trouthafordues, in the LA, where yearly LBA, that within free. 2003 foreign true support we lacked in the Olive Forge Sales, Copia del Source and Assault to the base. The yearly vigils for the two young women ultimately became a single event on each October 17th, the day of Harper's vanishing. A melancholy reunion of two families soon became a town tradition. 5 years later, more than 500 individuals came to the town square with candles and recollections of the two young women who had become synonymous with tragedy in Nihill County.
Years have gone by, and the investigation saw spurts of renewed energy, usually triggered by new forensic technology or fresh management at the sheriff's department. In 2006, the entire physical evidence was reanalyzed with enhanced DNA processing techniques. In 2008, the case files were digitized and checked with pattern matching software.
In 2012, ground-penetrating radar scanned 27 locations that had been pointed out by a geographic profiling algorithm. Every fresh attempt raised hopes and, as expected, shattering disillusionment. In 2007, a seeming breakthrough occurred when a Manitoba prison inmate said he knew something about Harper's case. Albert Kenner, serving a 15-year term for armed robbery, said he had heard another inmate confess to kidnapping a girl from an Alberta gas station. Detectives took 3 weeks verifying the tale, only to find it had been fabricated entirely in an attempt to get a transfer to a minimum security prison. That one hit particularly hard, admitted Detective Morgan Walsh, who by then had devoted nearly half her career to Lily Ross Deported. Our detective nearly half her career to for I catch farther loose. We'd gotten our hopes up. Worse, we'd gotten the family's hopes up, only to tell the Davises it was all a lie. That was one of the hardest moments of my career. The Lewis family also suffered such disappointments. In 2010, a woman in the province of British Columbia reported seeing Stella at work in a distant diner on the Yukon border. The lead was plausible enough that Richard Lewis took the 19-hour drive to see for himself if it was true, only to discover that the woman had but a casual resemblance to his daughter. "You learn how to guard yourself," Richard later wrote in the Foundation's newsletter. "But part of you always hopes it will be this time. This will be the solution. And when it isn't, it takes something away from you each time." By the 15th year of Harper's disappearance, a new generation had been raised in Nihill County. Teenagers knew of Harper and Stella only by local legend and annual school assemblies regarding personal safety. To them, the gas stations were simply locations their parents acted abnormally concerned about. They had no knowledge of the searches, the fear, or the tension that had filled the community, but the cases still lingered, albeit nominally, locate. Each new detective and sheriff had to go through the files as part of orientation. Pictures of the two women hung prominently in the briefing room of the department, and Sheriff Thompson, after he retired in 2014, would still call each month for an update. The 20th anniversary was the turning point for both families. Catherine Davis, who had been diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer the year before, spoke to the crowd at the vigil. But I have not given up hope that she will ever get justice. Someone out there knows. Someone always knew, and I think that the truth will rise to the surface even if I'm not around to witness it. 6 months later, Catherine died. Her husband, Thomas, took his sorrow and turned it into creating a private reward fund for tips leading to a solution in either case. The fund eventually reached $250,000 funded by donations from the community and from the sale of the Davis family farm. Thomas could not stay there anymore after Catherine died, said Reverend Michael Lawson, who had been the family's sponsor during the ordeal. There were too many ghosts, too many memories, but he ensured that money was used to keep the cases open. Their own problems were faced by the Lewis family. Their own problems were faced by the Lewis family. Marion and Richard divorced in 2018 as the pressure of their daughter's still unsolved disappearance wore away their marriage over time. Richard went back to Calgary while Marion stayed behind in Nihill County, dedicated to the foundation named after Stella. Some marriages survive this type of tragedy, Marion said to a parent support group for missing children. Ours wasn't one of them, but we remain united in our quest for Ants and Vidula. Ours wasn't one of them, but we remain united in our quest for ants. During these troubled years, investigators kept coming back to the initial hypothesis. An insider, someone with local knowledge, was behind both disappearances. The hypothesis gained further credence in 2020 when a detailed geography study found that both sites of abduction lay within cellular dead zones that had been present in the 1990s. This was no accident. It indicated close familiarity with local communications constraints. Whoever took these young women knew exactly where to do it, explained Dr. Lisa Harding, a criminal geographer consulted by the investigation team. They knew where cameras wouldn't capture the abduction. They knew where calls for help couldn't be made. This level of planning indicates someone who lived here, worked here, someone who knew this area. You knew that this area in our something for good. Someone who knew this area and moved me and stoop. Work to someone who learn. You were taking force. Someone who knew this area and as the years went on, technology improved and detectives centered on the one tangible piece of evidence they still had, the lone shoes that were left behind in every case, the tire tread soil samples, the partial fingerprints which had once been too smudged to analyze. All were safely kept in climate-controlled units, awaiting the day science may finally tell them what witnesses couldn't. Detective Morgan Walsh, who had become chief of detectives, police and detectives, his solicitors as ends to the protect of the Sluhai self-free, Detective Morgan Walsh, who had become chief of detectives at the Kinkalov, the King's 2 cell. Each Monday morning, she would draw a single piece of evidence or a single witness statement from the files and review it anew. The systematic routine had not yet borne fruit, but it kept the cases warm in an overextended department fragmented by newer crimes. You have to believe there's a chance for resolution, Walsh told a new detective, who asked why resources were being spent on such stale cases. Not for the families, but for just. There's someone out there who feels like they've gotten away with this. I won't let them be right. As of 2022, the Harper Davis and Stella Lewis cases had both gone cold for 29 and 23 years, respectively. The yearly vigil continued to bring a devoted but smaller crowd than previously seen. The reward funds sat untouched. The families waited patiently for answers that now seemed increasingly less probable by the year. No one could have predicted that the breakthrough, when it finally came, would shake Nihill County to its very core and force everyone to question what it truly means to know your neighbors. If this story resonates with you, please hit the like button. It helps more people discover these important cases. January 2023 brought with it a vicious chill, covering Nihill County in 18 inches of snow. Huddled at a workstation within the Alberta Provincial Forensics Laboratory in Edmonton, Dr. Elise Nakamura gazed intently at a screen showing a complicated series of genetic markers. Of more than a decade, she had been working through cold cases, but there was something about this specific sample that got her heart racing. "I need you to check these results," said Dr. Elise Nakamura, pushing her chair away from the monitor. At first sight, the sample she was analyzing didn't amount to much. A microscopic speck of DNA pulled from the inside heel of Harper Davis's recovered shoe. Tested countless times over the decades, its results were always the same. not enough material for identification. But this time around, Dr. Nakamura wasn't employing the typical treatment.
She was using a revolutionary technology called molecular ancestry tracing enhanced recovery, or MATER for short. Originally created to be used in archaeological studies, MATER enabled researchers to recreate functional DNA profiles from samples that had previously been deemed too far degraded or small. By amplifying targeted regions of the genome and employing quantum computing to complete lost sequences, MATER was able to bring to life evidence that had been deemed hopeless for years.
We'd waited 30 years for something like this, Detective Morgan Walsh subsequently wrote in her case notes. Science caught up to what we needed. The Alberta Bureau of Investigation had chosen 20 cold cases to test the MATER program. The Lewis and Davis disappearances were given top priority not merely because they were well known, but because both of the cases possessed intact physical evidence that had refrained for decades from being idyllic, from being a nature. Dr. Nakamura's lab spent 6 agonizing weeks analyzing the materials. From Harper's shoe, they recovered the weakest possible DNA from the inside heel, possibly deposited when the abductor touched it. Stella's boot produced similar results, along with the barely perceptible smear of biological substance on the leather. Then on January 23, 2023, everything shifted. The reconstructed DNA profiles were added to the Canadian National DNA Database. Within a few hours, the system returned a hit. It wasn't the offender himself, Dr. Nakamura explained during her briefing with Detective Walsh 3 days later, but almost certainly a close relative, a parent, sibling, or child. The match was from a willing DNA sample that had been submitted as part of a 2019 study. It is as part of a 2019 study. If were into level at Hemmering, I was yes part, and so 2019 study it is of the war. The name linked with that submission brought everyone to a standstill. Evelyn Richardson, a 52-year-old teacher from Nihill County. Walsh examined the photo, a smiling woman with soft, graying blonde hair, the type of teacher generations of children remembered with affection. "Are you absolutely sure of this match?" she asked softly. "The familial link is 99.8% conclusive," Dr. Nakamura verified. And then she just like, and then she no, yes, no, it's so highly acceptable. And then she rolled the 7 chance with that. Doc Harper's and Stella's DNA markers both match each other, so both women were nearly certainly abducted by the same individual. And this individual shares major genetic markers with Evelyn Richardson. Within hours, Detective Walsh handpicked a small, trusted contingent. They assembled in secret behind closed doors in a secure conference room at provincial headquarters in Edmonton, as far from curious eyes back in Nihill County as Poss back in Nihill County, as Poss and trucks, or Wool Potworthy as posted contingent, as far from curious eyes back in Nihill County as posted Bourbonfleur. We require complete family trees, up-to-date addresses, and alibis for the time frames involved, Walsh directed, and absolute discretion. If news travels back to Nihill prematurely before we are prepared, we may lose our suspect. As they burrowed into Evelyn Richardson's history, the team found she had 4 male relatives in the probable age bracket: her father, Maxwell Richardson, who died in 2010. Her brother, Daniel Lear, Daniel Solrito, were 4 in Quace and 10. Her brother, Daniel Lewis, or of Settles, in the Harper. Pearly Ashore, White, Stella Richardson, her danceless, play Tesla, her Tivels, who died in 2010. Her brother, her son, Jason Richardson, and her cousin, Robert Richardson. One name jumped out, Daniel. He had been 29 when Harper disappeared, 35 when Stella went missing. He'd lived in Nihill County his whole life. "What does Daniel do for a living?" Walsh asked, pen raised above her notepad. The investigator's reply rang cold through the room. "He's a paramedic. Been one since 1991. A paramedic, a trained individual, a trusted individual, an individual always at hand during moments of need. A person with medical expertise. A person familiar to everyone in the community. This is an individual who fits in, a person everyone trusts without hesitation. When the background checks returned, they showed that Daniel Richardson had not been a stranger to the inquiry by any means. He'd been interviewed twice in the original cases, once as a cooperative volunteer looking for Harper, and again years later when Stella disappeared, as a matter of routine canvassing emergency workers. Both times he'd been cleared, entirely unremarkable, entirely trusted. "We need him watched right now," Detective Walsh commanded, "and we need a means of taking his DNA without revealing our hand." What ensued was an operation that demanded absolute accuracy. For 2 weeks, undercover officers monitored Daniel Richardson's every step. He kept to himself in a small ranch-style house 5 miles outside of town. His life looked as normal as it could be: regular work at Nihill County Emergency Services, answering local medical calls, volunteering twice weekly at the youth center, and spending weekends with his sister Evelyn. "He's popular," one of the surveillance officers said. "Knows everyone by name, speaks to people on the sidewalk. He's not a fixture here." Then, on February 8th, a stroke of good fortune altered the course of history. Richardson broke for breakfast at a local diner prior to his shift. 2 undercover officers sat in the booth behind him, observing quietly as he sipped his coffee. When he departed, they locked up his discarded cup in an evidence bag and took it directly to Dr. Nakamura's laboratory. 24 hours earlier, on a secure video call, Dr. Nakamura stared into the camera and uttered only 3 words: "It's him." The DNA from the coffee mug matched both the crime scene samples, Harper's shoe and Stella's boot, beyond all doubt. "There's zero doubt, Detective," Nakamura continued. "Daniel Richardson is your perpetrator." Detective Walsh retreated in silence, 30 years of unspoken questions clicking into place. Daniel Richardson, the nice, reliable paramedic who had hugged neighbors, coordinated search parties, and stood alongside law enforcement during press conferences, had been the boogeyman in plain sight. "Has he been in the room with me?" she grumbled, recalling public hearings, candlelit vigils, even hurried chats she'd had with him over the year. "Has he heard me discuss these cases, aware of what he knew?" Once authorities had an idea where to search, things started to fall into place. Richardson's timesheets indicated he was off duty during both incidents. His medical background equipped him with the ability to incapacitate victims without leaving clear markings or traces. His occupation gave him insider information, dead spots for phone signals, path routes without cameras, and access to emergency units that nobody would ever suspect. The most shocking find was in old photographs. There was Daniel, standing out, assisting in searching for both missing girls, smiling, map in hand, standing with volunteers frantically trying to locate the very victims he'd kidnapped. He inserted himself into the inquiry, observed FBI consultant Dr. Robert Mercer, called in to examine the conclusions. "It's a characteristic behavior pattern among organized offenders. They like being involved in the search. It's all about control, power, playing the hero at the expense of concealing the truth." Now arrived the most sensitive part of all. If Richardson were to catch wind that he was a suspect, he could flee, or worse, destroy key evidence. The team required search warrants for his residence and car, but could not afford to alert him first and risk sabotaging what they had built so carefully. That's when a surprising tidbit emerged. Property records showed Richardson owned a second property, 30 acres of rural, wooded property listed under a small LLC he had fought. The site was almost impossible to reach, only via a dirt road that became mud in winter. Walsh hesitated not. "We have eyes on that land," she said, "but no presence on the ground, something he would not notice. The response was through technology out of reach in the 1990s, a high-altitude drone mission. Fitted with sophisticated thermal imagery, the Alberta Bureau of Investigation made surreptitious aerial sweeps over Richardson's clandestine acreage at night. The initial nights of drone monitoring brought nothing unusual, just thick forest and rocky landscape. But on the third evening, thermal imaging detected something anomalous. A rectangular spot, approximately 10 by 12 feet, was holding heat in a different way than the nearby Earth. It was located near a small clearing, approximately half a mile from the access trail. The temperature gradient indicates disturbed Earth, the technical analyst said, in keeping with a building that was either buried or demolished in the past few decades. It was sufficient to persuade a judge to issue limited search warrants. On February 15, 2023, during Daniel Richardson's duty at the Emergency Services Station, a team of expert forensic archaeologists and investigators descended on his rural property. What they found would stun even the most experienced detectives. Under 18 inches of earth in the section identified by the thermal imaging was the concrete slab of what used to be a small shed or cabin. The building itself had been taken down and hauled away, but ground-penetrating radar detected something more, something else, an anomaly 6 feet in length, 4 feet under the foundation. By evening, the dark reality was confirmed. There were human remains eventually identified by dental records as Harper Davis that had been buried there. The placement implied she had been buried before the building had been constructed, essentially camouflaging the evidence under a subsequently demolished building. The find galvanized the investigation. With Harper on Richardson's property, judges soon drew up sweeping warrants for his house, cars, computers, and all other holdings associated with him. Even retired Sheriff Dale Thompson, who had been out of the saddle for many years, was called back in to advise. His face paled as Walsh briefed him. "Daniel Richardson," he whispered, shaking his head. He was part of the first response when Thomas Davis suffered his heart attack in 2007. He saved the life of Thomas's, the father of the same daughter he kidnapped. He saved him. 2 days after that, on February 17th, a snowstorm covered Nihill County as investigators served the search warrants on Richardson's house. Coincidence was not an issue here. The storm helped conceal things, reducing the likelihood of anyone observing out-of-the-ordinary activity. Within the apparently mundane ranch house, detectives uncovered a secret room hidden behind a false wall in the basement. There, neatly stored boxes held photos, personal belongings, and diaries, agonized records that told the full horror of what had been done to Harper Davis and Stella Lewis. Still more horrific, there were suggestions that Richardson may have had further victims besides these two young women. The neighborhood had remained blissfully unaware that the respected paramedic who had responded to emergencies, calmed neighbors, and saved lives possessed a darkness so deep it had gone undetected for over 30 years. As of February 18, 2023, Nihill County remained under 8 inches of snow. Behind the wheels of the mobile command center a half-mile away from Richardson's land, Detective Morgan Walsh pored over the evidence board constructed overnight. Photographs, timelines, forensic analysis over nearly every inch. At the center of it all was Richardson's DMV photo, 51 years old, salt and pepper hair, confident grin. "Those are the eyes," Walsh whispered to Sheriff Thompson, who hadn't yet left for a late 9-9 immediately. A late 9 Wolsdorfen, who hadn't yet left for a late 9 for the Portland. So, the hordes are close. "So are the eyes," Walsh whispered to Sheriff Thompson, who hadn't yet left for a late 9. "I've interviewed him 3 times, at least over the past few decades, sat across from him during community meetings, and I never noticed it." "None of us did," Thompson added softly, the weight of the decades-old case settling on him. "How he lasted as long as he did," Walsh whispered, gazing at the evidence laid out on the table. The searching of Daniel Richardson's secret basement room had revealed much, much more than anyone could. You'll the thinking none, so Curtis, Nanny Tinty. He's the Frofton, who, for enough we can ever stinging so, Harold and the Tent Win, had revealed much more than anyone could say glorious. In those carefully labeled boxes, each stamped with date and place, were things that could have belonged only to Harper Davis and Stella Lewis. There was Harper's missing shoe, the companion to the one discovered at the gas station, Stella's student ID card, journals written in a detached, clinical voice detailing the abductions step by step, and, worst of all, photographs recording the crimes themselves. He stored trophies, said forensic psychologist Dr. Sarah Levinson, who had been called in to work on the case, but not typically the way we see with offenders who are impulsive. This is different, more scientific. The journals are like case studies. It's like he was studying himself as much as he was studying his victims. Evidence indicated Richardson had employed his paramedic training to immobilize both women with sedatives stolen from the workplace, attributing the absence of struggle or defensive wounds. His journal proved a cold level of premeditation, each kidnapping meticulously planned around camera blind spots and cellular dead zones in the region. But most alarming to investigators were the revelations of 3 other boxes with dates and places listed on them that had no record of missing persons in Nihill County. Walsh then ordered a wider search. Increase the radius, she directed. Search for missing women within 300 battery slimming slum dress. 300 first bar with furious links near him says, sorry you for 300 silist. Or here in the Warwick's left close with news of the real. Since 200 give her some research. Young women, same victim profiles, lonely areas, gas stations, anything that matches. As databases were being searched by analysts for possible additional victims, forensic examiners continued to search Richardson's property. Ground-penetrating radar scans exposed another anomaly about half a mile from where Harper's body had been discovered. Second sight, a technician indicated, pointing at the screen. Same shape, same composition of soil. Approximately 10 by 12 feet. Walsh called for an immediate digging. By noon, the crew made the dark confirmation human remains, which were later confirmed as Stella Lewis, were buried where once there was the foundation of a small storage shed. He constructed buildings on top of his graves, said forensic anthropologist Dr. Martin Blackwood, and then tore them down years later, most likely when he suspected investigators were closing in or when he was getting ready to sell the property. Records indicate Richardson had put the property on the market 2 months prior, a chilling epiphany. Had the discovery occurred any later, the evidence could have been destroyed once and for all. As forensic experts worked the excavation sites, another team of investigators pieced together, another team of investigators pieced together, another team of investigators pieced together. His work history showed a chilling pattern. He took time off immediately after each disappearance, claiming solo camping excursions, leaving him alone on his isolated property. Even his small online presence told a damning story. Throughout his years, Richardson had Googled news stories about the 2 cases, monitoring them obsessively. More recently, he'd investigated breakthroughs in DNA extraction and forensic testing, the same technologies that ultimately brought him down. He knew we were closing in, Walsh growled. The science was catching up with him. And maybe the most chilling news wasn't in the evidence, it was in the ways Richardson had inserted himself into the lives of his victims' families. He had made donations to the Stella Lewis Foundation. He had been present at every vigil since 2000. And ironically, he had rendered emergency medical aid to both families on the night Thomas Davis had his heart attack in 2007. This is not just hiding in plain sight, Dr. Levinson said to the team in a briefing. This is psychological insertion. He didn't avoid suspicion, he inserted himself into the healing process. He inserted himself into the story, into the grief, into the memory. We have physical evidence connecting him with both known victims, she informed the prosecution team. We have his DNA at both crime scenes. We have the journals. But I want more. I want to know there's no way he gets away with it. The last piece of the puzzle fit when researchers linked Richardson's workday schedule with the 3 other cases proposed by his marked boxes. Whenever a teenage girl had vanished in the adjacent counties, Richardson had been sent as a paramedic, either for emergency training or fill-in duty, putting him precisely where the crimes took place. His work had provided him with the best alibi a paramedic is entitled to be anywhere at any time. Nobody would ever suspect him. Now, the case extended outside of Nihill County. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police led the charge to coordinate a multi-jurisdictional response. The investigators opted to take Richardson into custody at the emergency services station instead of his home, decreasing the chances that he would destroy evidence or injure himself if he knew authorities were closing in on him. On February 21st, as Richardson arrived for his 7 a.m. shift, he was met not by colleagues, but by Deputy Commissioner Alan Grayson of the RCMP in the break room. Daniel Richardson, Grayson stated as tactical officers moved into position behind him. You're under arrest for the murders of Harper Davis and Stella Lewis. According to officers present, Richardson showed no visible reaction beyond a slight tight, beyond a slight tight, swerve, a slight tight, beyond a slight tight, beyond a slight tight, chimness, car, chung, slight tight, intent to sleep, killed, just slight tight, in short, this tight seer, phrase, and on stores. He complied silently as he was handcuffed and read his rights. His only words spoken so quietly that Grayson nearly missed them. I was wondering when you'd finally figure it out. The arrest created shockwaves in Nihill County. There, Sheriff Thompson, temporarily out of retirement but recalled to assist with coordinating the response, stood alongside Detective Walsh to make an announcement that many were unable to believe. Today, after close to 30 years of looking, we have taken into custody a suspect in the disappearance of Harper Davis and Stella Lewis, Thompson said, his voice firm, though the emotion he could not entirely mask. The suspect is veteran Nihill County paramedic Daniel Richardson. The unified gasp of the gathered crowd could be heard even on news reports. Richardson wasn't recognizable by face only. He was trusted, respected, even loved. Parents whose kids he had cared for, older folks he had rescued from heart attacks, and community leaders who had worked with him were all in shock. As word of the arrest spread, police kept working through Richardson's properties, eventually recovering 5 burial grounds in all. Initial forensic tests suggested at least 5 victims over a period of almost 2 decades, 1993 to 2012, a reign of terror gone entirely undetected. The degree of compartmentalization is staggering, Dr. Levinson said in an initial psychological evaluation. Richardson had 2 completely different personas, the respected first responder committed to saving lives and the meticulous predator who took them. His ease in switching between these personas without being detected is a very rare and extreme instance of psychological compartmentalization. For Detective Morgan Walsh, who had spent most of her career cracking these cases, the arrest generated mixed emotions. There's relief, of course, she acknowledged in a quiet moment with Sheriff Thompson, her eyes fixed on the evidence board still covered in timelines and photos. But beneath relief was the burden of decades wasted, families destroyed, and trust broken, a reminder of how long evil can go undiscovered in plain sight. Thompson's hand did not leave Walsh's shoulder as she let out her breath slowly, 30 years weighing upon her chest. Because he planned his whole life to go unnoticed, Thompson reminded her gently. That's what predators do. They conform. They fit in. They become what we most trust. As Richardson was booked at the Provincial Detention Center, police investigators set the stage for what was to be one of Alberta's most complicated prosecutions, a 3-decade case with more jurisdictions and at least 5 victims. No single move could be sloppy, no shred of evidence loose. February 21, 2023 dawned like any other cold winter morning at the Nihill County Emergency Services Station. The night crew finished reports and restocked materials as the day shift trickled in, scraping off snow and warming their fingers around coffee cups. Among them was Daniel Richardson, who came in at exactly 6:45 a.m. as he had every morning for the last 32 years. He pulled his silver Ford F-150 into the familiar place, third from the left in a miniature awning. Security cameras later captured him smoothing the rear-view mirror with his eyes, adjusting his department-issue jacket, picking up his duffel bag, and striding toward the employee entrance with the easy air of a man where he ought to be. Within, he greeted the night dispatcher informally, commented on the snow, and went into the break room to refrigerate his lunch, a ritual repeated thousands of times previously. What Richardson was not aware of was that the station had been covertly infiltrated in the previous hour. The overnight staff had received instructions just in time for his arrival to operate business as usual. Day shift colleagues he had anticipated were running late and stood in for them, tactical officers dressed in paramedic uniforms. Hiding in the break room stood Deputy Commissioner Alan Grayson of the RCMP and 2 senior staff members, ready to neutralize the situation with complete authority. Grayson would go on to write in his official report, "We had to reduce risk to the public, to our officers, and even to Richardson himself. The station was familiar to him, but easily secured by our team." As Richardson opened the door to the break room, his face flashed with brief confusion at the unfamiliar faces that greeted him. Before he could move, Grayson interceded. "Daniel Richardson," he stated formally. "I'm Deputy Commissioner Grayson with the RCMP. You're under arrest for the murders of Harper Davis and Stella Lewis." Multiple witnesses later noted Richardson's reaction was almost imperceptible, a slight stiffening of posture, a subtle tightening around the eyes. He made no attempt to flee or resist, allowing officers to secure his arms and apply handcuffs with practiced efficiency. "You have the right to remain silent," Grayson went on, reading the caution statement. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney." Throughout, Richardson had a strangely serene demeanor, unnerving even the most experienced officers. It wasn't until the rights had been completely read that he finally broke the silence. His voice almost a whisper, "I was wondering when you'd finally figure it out." The arrest had been carefully planned, every detail. Within minutes, Richardson was led to an unmarked, tinted-window police car. The emergency services station had been immediately condemned as a secondary crime scene, all people taken in for interviews, and the building sealed for rigorous forensic processing. By mid-afternoon, Nihill County streets were unnervingly still, the normal commotion covered over by whispers, murmurs, and small groups of neighbors exchanging shocked looks. National news trucks followed the highway into town, satellite antennas pointed upwards as reporters delivered live reports to Alberta and Canadian audiences far beyond. For most residents, the fact that within the county's emergency services building, employees grappled to match their recollections of Richardson with the emerging allegations. Paramedics and officers who had trained and served with him now replayed each shared shift, each call, each community event, searching for indicators they might have missed all along. "We all knew him," one grizzled paramedic acknowledged, voice shaking. "And we never suspicious of this." In the meantime, investigators pursued Phase 3 of the operation, carefully searching Richardson's storage container, locker, and car. All pieces of paperwork, financial records, and personal belongings were cross-checked against timelines of suspected and confirmed disappearances. Forensic experts documented photographs, diaries, and items that matched items found on the victims, further solidifying evidence for prosecution. The community briefing, though, was a tightrope. Sheriff Thompson, sensing the emotional tension in the room, went on. I know this is nearly impossible to believe. Daniel Richardson was a man we relied on for decades, but the investigation, conducted by Detective Walsh and assisted by several agencies, has brought forward overwhelming evidence that connects him with the vanishings of Harper Davis and Stella Lewis and perhaps other victims. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. A guy. Some residents clutched their chests, others wept quietly. A few, frozen in disbelief, could not reconcile the idea that the man who had comforted them during emergencies could simultaneously have caused unimaginable harm. Evelyn Richardson, Daniel's sister, stood back in the wings, her expression impenetrable but ashen. Later, investigators would comment that relatives of perpetrators of crimes tend to suffer from secondary trauma because the intellectual dissonance between what they had believed their loved one to be like and what happened was almost impossible to overcome. Community psychologist Dr. Helen Morris said the betrayal is deep. Not only is trust broken, it's turned into a weapon. If someone with authority and concern like Richardson gets caught, the shockwaves hit the whole social system. Not just him, but the systems that enabled him to stay in the shadows for so long get questioned. By the evening hours, the phone lines at the station were filled with residents calling to inquire whether Richardson had called back regarding their family emergencies, some needing reassurance, others trying in vain to rationalize the ghastly reality. Schools and youth programs set up temporary counseling programs, and numerous churches opened their facilities for community support meetings. Around town, the word spread rapidly, leading off social media and national news cycles. The headlines highlighted the haunting dual nature of Richardson's existence, the respected paramedic and the methodical stalker whose crimes went unchecked for 30 years. Within the next few days, investigators were ready to conduct a multi-jurisdictional examination of all cold cases in Richardson's service areas, expecting that more victims would by Detective Walsh and her team coordinated with RCMP divisions, forensic experts, and community liaisons so that both evidence gathering and public outreach were done with care and accuracy. The arrest was not only a turning point for cold cases, but also a shared encounter with the disquieting reality that an otherwise ordinary, trusted, and even admired person could contain unimaginable evil. Nihill County would never look at community safety, trust, or emergency services in the same light again. If you'd like, I can keep going with the initial courtroom session and how the prosecution constructed the case against Richardson, such as witness accounts, forensic evidence presentation, and then ultimately the deconstruction of his well-built life. Do you want me to proceed with that next? The courtroom was a masterful exercise in The courtroom was a masterful exercise in Nihill. The courtroom was a masterful exercise in a deconstruction with aspect. The man was a masterful courtroom with it because time of a master court. Opposite one another, the family of Harper Davis and Stella Lewis sat together, hands clasped firmly, faces white and etched with decades of fear and sorrow. Across from them, Daniel Richardson's family, especially his sister Evelyn, stood serene but internally struggling, though her eyes gave away the battle of reconciling love and doubt. Between them, reporters wrote furiously, cameras captured every movement, and microphones heard even the sly. Judge Lorraine Whitaker entered at 8:30 sharp, her presence automatically brooking no noise. She scanned the courtroom, her eyes encompassing the gathered public, the press, and the legal teams. We are here to conduct the trial of Daniel Richardson, accused of murdering Harper Davis and Stella Lewis. She started. All individuals will be subject to the court rules of procedure. Interruptions will not be brooked. Detective Morgan Walsh, flanked by the prosecution team, double-checked her notes for the final time. Each witness account, forensic finding, and chronology detail was carefully laid out for this moment. Facing her, defense attorney Martin Greaves calmly prepped Richardson, whose calm self contained despite the tense atmosphere. The prosecution began with a graphic account describing a man who had led a dual life. The publicized paramedic and the publicized paramedic Goran by A's the publicized paramedic and Portvi the publicized paramedic in Tismaplok. With the multiple public that and general reduced the looking began working for the babe. Walsh testified as the first witness, guiding the jury through the investigation that lasted 30 years. She explained how Richardson had inserted himself into the search efforts, joined the vigils, and kept up his public image, concealing his crimes.
There were digital exhibits offered, such as pictures of the evidence they had recovered on Richardson's isolated property, foundations of the underground structures, the forensic maps of where the victims were buried, and boxes labeled with the victims' personal effects.
Forensic experts also testified to the DNA connections, Harper's and Stella's bodies connecting directly to Richardson by both direct and familial samples, and the coffee cup test to verify his genetic signature. Dr. Elise Nakamura described the groundbreaking MATER technology employed to rebuild deteriorated DNA. This is a process that enabled us to span decades of investigative impasse, she testified. Without it, these cases may have forever been cold cases. Her evidence came with visual charts of genetic markers and familial relationships that left the jury in no doubt. Defense tactic, however, highlighted Richardson's years of public service. Greaves contended that the evidence might be tainted, claiming procedural mistakes in processing decades-old DNA samples. "My client spent his life serving others," he said to the jury. "We must be sure that these charges are based on unshakable fact and not tenuous associations." As the trial worked its way through the first day, the prosecution methodically assembled Richardson's travel patterns, vacations, and call records of emergency calls, establishing his whereabouts with each disappearance and constructing an impossible-to-ignore timeline. Witnesses testified from former coworkers, neighborhood volunteers, and police officers about Richardson's seeming hard work and reliable nature, set against the detached, detail-driven criminal picture constructed over years of investigation. By evening, the courtroom hummed with a combination of shock, tension, and grim comprehension. For the people of Nihill County and the families of the victims, the first day of trial served to confirm that decades of suspicion had been rightfully aimed at the respected paramedic who had affected so many lives under the public eye was at the center of an unimaginable string of atrocities. If you wish, I can proceed with the following trial days, such as witness testimony from forensic scientists, relatives, and the shocking findings from Richardson's diaries, towards the deliberation and final verdict of the jury. Would you like me to go on with that? The courtroom came close to silence as she walked towards the witness stand, her eyes locking briefly with those of her brother, Daniel, at the defense table. She took a deep breath before being sworn in and starting to testify. "I never thought so," she started, her tone firm but laced with emotion. "Daniel was always the picture of kindness, the neighbor everyone trusted. I had no notion that behind closed doors he might be capable of what he might be capable of what we might be capable of what doors he might be capable of what is pleaded court the grail always you believe boarded the words still cut all of the worst dead. Daniel was all." She took a moment to compose herself. "I voluntarily gave my DNA for a cancer study back in 2019. I had no notion back then it might end up being used someday to crack these decades-old vanishings." The prosecution walked her slowly through how her DNA had implicated investigators in a familial match and ended up finding Daniel to be the probable culprit. She described how shocked and surprised she had been when law enforcement first called her and how cooperative she was with the investigation, including giving more details about family members and past movements that at first might have been thought to be nothing but took on a crucial role in Seeing the evidence, the belongings, the journals, the photographs, Evelyn's voice cracked a little. It was appalling. And yet I had to assist to ensure justice could at last be done for Harper and Stella and for any others who could have been impacted. Detective Walsh supported Evelyn's testimony, describing to the jury how the familial DNA match had been the key to finally overcoming the decades-long stalemate. Without Evelyn's willing submission, Walsh said to the jury, "We may never have been able to establish Richardson's link to these crimes. Her bravery in stepping forward allowed us to pursue the evidence to its destination." The defense tried to impeach Evelyn's credibility, relying on the emotional toll of having to testify against a relative. Greaves claimed that what she said was tainted by hindsight and media exposure, not objective memory and quorum. Not objective memory. Look on here, not objective memory and chess. You bleed, Chris? Liars, sunny pants were tid. Not objective, memory and exposure. Not objective, memory.
The jury, however, could witness the genuineness in her testimony, a sister outraged at what she learned, but pointedly firm in her dedication to truth and justice. By day 12, Evelyn's testimony had left its mark. The combination of her familial bond, her voluntary provision of DNA, and her agreement to offer detailed information about her brother's past movements bolstered the prosecution's tale that Daniel Richardson had carefully planned and covered up his offense while continuing the appearance of a reliable community member. If you'd like, I can pick up on the last days of trial, from the defense's closing remarks, the jury deliberations, and finally the verdict itself, highlighting the tension within the courtroom and the release of feelings of the families. Do you want me to go on with that? The conviction of Daniel Richardson was a turning point not just for Nihill County but for investigative techniques throughout Canada. Police agencies started re-examining decades-old cold cases, realizing that technological innovations, such as MATR, might finally bring closure where old-fashioned methods had not succeeded. Training programs included lessons from the Richardson case, the need to closely examine trusted community figures, cross-checking family DNA databases, and having fastidious evidence preservation over decades.
For the families, closure was mixed. Memorials, scholarships, and foundations still remembered Harper Davis and Stella Lewis, ensuring their memories lived on in a way that raised community awareness regarding missing persons. The Harper Davis Veterinary Scholarship and the Stella Lewis Foundation grew, being living reminders that their tragedy had spurred change and support for others. Psychologists and criminologists used the case as an instance of extreme compartmentalization among offenders, how someone could have a respectable public image while committing horrific crimes behind closed doors. Dr. Sarah Levinson went on to write a paper based on Richardson's case about the blending of narcissism, social camouflage, and deliberate predation, which has become a seminal reference work in forensic psychology curricula and sing as psychology curricula. Nihill County itself gradually recovered. Its annual vigils persisted, now serving as community gatherings to celebrate resilience and the force of public watchfulness. Citizens recognized that some wounds would endure, but justice, albeit late, had made fear become empowering. The Richardson case is a grim reminder evil comes in the most recognizable packages, and patience of unyielding inquiry along with scientific ingenuity can ultimately see through even the greatest deceptions. It is a mantra that has become a guiding principle in the world of investigations today, what is referred to as the Richardson Protocol. Never allow a cold case to remain cold. It's all about looking at old evidence again with new tech, however desperate it may have initially seemed. As Detective Morgan Walsh said at a Toronto law enforcement conference, occasionally the evidence that was worthless 30 years ago is precisely what we are looking for today. No case should ever be deemed genuinely cold, she stated. It's simply waiting for technology to catch up. For the families who waited decades for answers, finally getting them brought a mix of relief, grief, and a whole lot of unexpected emotions. Thomas Davis, who had spent most of his life searching for his daughter Harper, suddenly faced the challenge of learning how to live without that search defining him. For 30 years, finding Harper was my purpose, he shared in a rare interview. Each morning I woke up expecting maybe this would be the Deverat. Each morning I woke up expecting maybe this would be the de. Now we have them, and I'm learning to live with closure rather than hope. It's a different type of grief. Marion Lewis also turned her own loss into something of substance. She grew the Stella Lewis Foundation, which now provides specialized training in evidence preservation for rural law enforcement officers to make best use of future technological advances. The foundation also provides a yearly scholarship to students interested in forensic science, providing future generations of investigators with tools investigators decades earlier could merely imagine. Maybe the most significant effect of the case, however, is how it has shifted communities' perceptions of trust and safety. Richardson's years of lying compelled a hard realization. Evil doesn't always present itself as we might imagine. We want to believe we can identify the monsters, wrote Dr. Helen Morris in her Community Impact Report. Richardson taught us that predators don't always appear like our nightmares. Occasionally, they appear just like our heroes, and that's a bitter pill for any group to swallow. And as Nihill County heals, the annual vigil for Harper and Stella has changed. Once a mournful commemoration of unquiet questions, now it's a celebration of justice being done. Last October, more than 1,000 residents gathered in the town square, candles in hand, not in sorrow, but in appreciation of lives lost and truth uncovered. For 3 decades, Harper and Stella had united the community in mourning. At ceremony, Catherine Davis's sister addressed the audience. Now they bring us together in a commitment to remember, to stay vigilant, and to never again allow evil to hide so comfortably among us. And for those watching this story unfold with us, if it struck a chord, share it with someone who appreciates the dedication behind true crime investigations. And don't forget to subscribe. There are more solved cases to explore. And the C really, and the V are in the full bait and solved. The V, don't forget to subscribe. There are more solved cases to explore. And the from a new the Aries is as full of the